Well, hello, and thank you for joining us for this Complete College America session on tools for change, policy, collaboration, and implementation. And today we are looking at how the Nevada system of higher education established a comprehensive student remediation reform work in the entire state to scale among all of our Nevada system of higher education institutions. We're pleased to partner with Complete College America for this presentation. We're thankful for CCA for inviting us to do this as part of the Equity and Justice for All virtual event. My name is James McCoy, and I serve as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Success at the Nevada System of Higher Education. Today, I am joined by my colleagues, Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs, Crystal Abbe, and Senior Research Analyst for the Nevada System of Higher Education, Dr. Theo Meek. We have a myriad of goals that we want to sort of highlight today as we get into this hour or so presentation. We'll start today by talking briefly about the Nevada System of Higher Education strategic goals and how these goals help to inform the strategic direction, of course, and also in tactics and strategies associated with helping us meet these system-wide goals. We'll talk a little bit about how the Nevada System of Higher Education has partnered with Complete College America for several years and the various game changers and strategies that CCA has helped us in our implementation and thought partnering within the state of Nevada. Then we'll transition to talking about how we arrived at really identifying the need for this remediation work statewide, and we'll look at some of the specific challenges that Nevada has faced within the remediation space for math and English over the years. And that really served as a catalyst for the development and implementation of our NSHE co-requisite and college-ready gateway policy that we'll talk about. And then it wouldn't be a presentation complete without describing some of the early lessons that we've learned in this experience so far. Then we will transition to the implementation phase of this work and provide an overview of how we have approached statewide scaled implementation of the co-requisite platform. We'll talk about our timeline for implementation, our system-wide approach to building our implementation action plan, and through collaboration, we'll talk about where we are today, and finish with a couple of lessons learned and challenges that we had to overcome as a system in our implementation efforts. Before we get started in the nitty-gritty, I want to provide a little bit of context for the Nevada System of Higher Education. We are one state public education system. We are governed by one Board of Regents across the entire state. Our Board of Regents are made up of 13 elected members. They oversee the statewide governance of 7 teaching institutions. Within those 7 teaching institutions, we have 4 community colleges who offer a variety of different certificates, associate degrees, and select baccalaureate degrees. We have 1 state college, and we have 2 research universities that are Carnegie classified. And we have 1 research institute represented both in the north and south of Nevada. It's called the Desert Research Institute as well. Over the last several years, the Nevada System of Higher Education and its institutions have experienced multiple leadership changes. And so that has certainly played a role in many ways in terms of how we have engaged our work around student success and closing achievement gaps, not the least of which is the topic of today, our remediation reform work. So more on that in just a few minutes. For now, I'd like to turn it over to our Vice Chancellor, Crystal Abbe.
Good morning, James, and thank you for that introduction. I'm Crystal Abbe, the Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs. My job today is to provide some context to the adoption of the policy. And so starting out, you'll see in this slide, this is basically the board strategic goals that were adopted in 2018. And you can see they're pretty straightforward: student access, student success, closing the achievement gap, workforce and development, and promoting the research enterprise across the system. These goals, and we'll talk more about this later in the presentation, really provided the backdrop for co-rec. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is the fact that there was an aligning of the stars and certain events had to occur that led up to the adoption of the co-rec mandate. But essentially, these goals and the strategies that were required and developed behind the scenes for each of these goals really led to the co-requisite mandates. In addition to the goals, next slide, please. In addition to the goals, we wanted to provide a little bit of background in terms of Nevada's involvement in Complete College America. We have been a state member of the Alliance since 2010. when CCA first began. And as many of you are aware, as becoming an Alliance member, you had to basically agree to aggressively pursue certain game changers that were all about promoting student success and closing the achievement gap. To that end, our approach in Nevada was multi-level. There were certain game changer approaches that were taking place at the institution level and others that took place across the system. So to begin, Momentum's Pathways, that was a consortium of institutions in Southern Nevada that worked to promote student success through a grant that was provided by Complete College America. And the result of that work at some institutions, for example, ended with meta majors and other informational tools that can help put students on the road to success. In addition, another example of an institution level game changer was pursuing areas of study and defining those areas of study. However, at the system level, I don't know if you're a member of Complete College America, then you're very familiar with 15 to Finish. That was one of our first system-wide game changers, in addition to the funding formula. Our funding formula essentially shifted from a formula that was based on students being in seats and purely in enrollment to a formula that is now based on student success, where our institutions receive their share of state funding based on course completions and degree completers. Following the adoption of the funding formula, we looked at more specifically at student success. And so then came the Gateway Math and English Initiative. And we're going to talk a lot about that today, because the 7 years of work that preceded the CoREC mandate really laid the foundation for the work that we're doing today. And then, of course, the purpose of today's presentation, which is the adoption of our CoREC mandate in math and English across the system. So as I mentioned, there was an aligning of the stars. And this is critical context because absent some of these events, I don't know that we would be where we were at today. And as James indicated early on, we've been through a period in the last 5 years where we've had a number of leadership changes. And of course, as an elected board, we always have new board members coming in. But all of this work basically, the spark to all of this began in Chicago in November 2018. And it was at that event where we were presenting to the CCA Alliance on our work in the Gateway Initiative. And essentially what that policy did, again, the foundational work there required that students be on a pathway for the completion of their Gateway Math and English requirement within the first year of enrollment or within the first 3 semesters if they were a STEM major. That discussion and realizing that we've come only so far with the Gateway Initiative, but we still have more work to do, then led to, as I previously mentioned, the adoption of the board's strategic goals. And with each strategic goal, the board took a systemic approach to reviewing the goals individually, determining what we were doing within the system that was working, but where we needed improvement. And that's when we brought in Bruce Vandal from Complete College America, and he presented to the board in January of 19. That January of 19 presentation really was the beginning of our statewide conversation on CoREC. Followed shortly thereafter, and Theo is going to go into this in great detail, the presentation of a white paper to our board on why what we had been doing historically with traditional remediation was not serving our students well. And as a result, many who could be graduating were not graduating. And followed by Theo's paper, then the big event itself, the adoption of the CoREC mandate. And under that mandate, our institutions were required to have full-scale implementation by fall of 21. So those events, again, the aligning of the stars. But Theo's now going to talk to you about the 7 years of work that laid the foundation for that aligning of the stars. Theo?
Thank you, Crystal, and good morning. As Crystal's discussed, there have been a number of critical components that have happened throughout the past 7 years that have aligned, that have allowed us to adopt such an aggressive co-requisite policy. From 2012 to 2015, some of the main cornerstones were on laying the foundation of data that said that traditional remediation does not work. It first started with the Remedial Transformation Project in 2012, which began to highlight some of the concerns with remediation as far as students progressing, students completing the remedial sequences, And that remedial transformation project report was crescendoed, I guess you could say, by the task force on Gateway Mathematics Success and their report and recommendations, which was published in April of 2015. It was in this report that we looked individually at institutions and more specifically individual pathways for students. For example, students placed into remediation, students placed directly into the college level, placement versus enrollment. And we really began to see a lot of the major challenges associated with students placed in and enrolled into traditional developmental education pathways, with some students 150% graduation rate being as low as 0.8%. So it was this report that led us to adopt the Gateway Core Success Policy, which was really the preceding factor that a lot of us believe allowed us to move to a co-requisite adoption last year. The Gateway Core Success Policy was a opportunity for us as a system to more strongly assist with implementation at the institutional level. This was really one of the first times that the system office was as involved with implementation as it was. I was at that point serving as the implementation liaison in my graduate program as a graduate intern, because I came from an institution that had a very strong adoption of the Gateway Core Success Policy. So in holding the institution's hands to the fire throughout those years, it really became obvious that this allowed us to move towards a co-rec mandate. And that was summarized in my 2019 policy paper, the results of which I'll discuss later. To give everyone an idea as to what we were up against before we looked at the co-requisite adoption, this is a figure detailing out the multiple pathways that existed prior to the co-requisite adoption. At some of our institutions, students would be required to take up to 4 semesters or 4 separate courses of remediation before proceeding on to the Gateway course. And in some instances, some of our institutions, one in particular that I can think of, utilized AccuPlacer as a final exam for some of those remedial courses. So even if a student was successful in completing a course below the high school level, if they were unable to pass the AccuPlacer, they were required to retake the course until they could pass the AccuPlacer. This is these are issues complicated onto one another when you think about the efficacy of AccuPlacer and its ability partnered with 4 levels of remediation. So this was really what we were up against in moving some of our institutions from a 5-semester pathway to Gateway Math completion to a 1-semester pathway of Gateway course completion. When we started discussing with the institutions the Gateway Core Success Policy, we heard multiple times that the Gateway or that the co-requisite policy would not work in Nevada because our students, they're just different. And we heard that time and time again, whether it was placing blame on preparation practices from the school districts, or just by nature of living in Nevada, our students were just different. Well, when we looked at the data, we found that that's just not the case. As much as we would love to believe that Nevada students are so much different than the national landscape, when you look at the data, particularly as it relates to developmental education practices, Nevada is no different than the national data. Our placement rates are comparable. The number of ethnic minorities that are enrolled is higher in some instances of the national data, but just about on par with national. And even complicated, our degree completion rates are actually even lower than the national average. 8% of students who placed into remediation will graduate versus national norms, which are hovering between 9 and 10%. One of the big reasons why we were successful in completing the co-requisite policy is because of its concerted emphasis on eliminating the discriminatory practices of placing students in of the overrepresentation of minority students in developmental education. This was a massive finding for us and a major point of concern that our board expressed when we began presenting on policy paper. As you can see, the comparison between the national data from the 2014 Complete College America cohort to our 2016 Gateway cohort of historically underrepresented minorities in higher education, Nevada had either overrepresentation or was on par with the national data. Digging into the data more, when we looked at the degree completion rates, we saw really dismal numbers of students who were enrolled in math remediation, either below the high school level, at the high school level, or who did not take math in their first year. This is a quick screenshot showing 2014 and 2015 cohorts and their 150% degree completion rates. You'll notice some numbers look a little bit high. For example, that final institution, 38% graduation rate, but we're dealing 38% graduation rate for those less than high school. But in that instance, we're dealing with a really small N. But by and large, of students who enrolled in their required remediation, the graduation rates were between 10 and 15% on average. And I want to make a quick note that this data is on enrolled students. When we look at placed students, the graduation rates are significantly lower, echoing some of the concerns that enrollment and placement are two separate but interrelated beasts to tackle. And with that, that is much of what I've just talked about was the conclusion that came out of the policy paper that I crafted. First being traditional remediation is just not working. Too many start in remediation and are unsuccessful in completing their gateway course. And it's absolutely no surprise when the pathway is 4 remedial courses deep before they make it into the gateway course. Additionally, there are psychological challenges and long pathways to gateway course completion. Students take psychological harm when they sit down with their advising appointment and they're told, you're not college level material quite yet, but if you take these 4 classes, pay the credits for it, and spend 2 years in remediation, then you'll be college level material. That is a significant challenge. Additionally, as Crystal's mentioned, our board has a very significant a concerted focus on closing achievement gaps. And in order to close the achievement gaps, we are a very, very, very strong believer that you have to reform developmental education practices in order to close achievement gaps because of the sheer number of underrepresented students that are enrolled in remediation. Additionally, co-requisite remediation results in much higher student success outcomes. One of the data points that we hit over and over and over was that there is no data out there to support any student population, to support the notion that any student population fares better in traditional developmental education than they do in co-requisite. Across math, across English, adult learners, even students with an ACT of a 13, all student populations studied fared better in co-requisite support. And we were lucky that we had 2 institutions that were practicing co-requisite support whose success data mirrored a lot of the national support data. And it was just a matter of working on scaling those practices at those 2 institutions. And as I've talked about before, regardless of the level of academic preparation, success levels of students in the co-requisite model are far superior to students in the traditional developmental education route. With that, I will pass it off to Crystal to talk about some findings from our Gateway project.
So thanks, Theo. Going back to the Gateway project, I think one of the most significant lessons that we learned, and I'm sure you all feel the same way in some cases, which is you cannot be a prophet in your own land. One of the questions that I always get is, well, you had all this foundational work with the Gateway policy. Why didn't you just adopt the co-rec mandate back in 2014? You'd be in a really different place today. Because in 2014, we had the one institution, UNR, which is a flagship university that had already gone down this path and they had great data that supported the efficacy of COREC. The challenge was nationally, that conversation was just starting to bubble up. And again, you can't be a prophet in your own land. And what we found was we actually had considerable resistance by all of our institutions who weren't willing to kind of jump off the cliff at that point. And that's why that foundational work became so important, because we took what was really considered an intermediate step in adopting a policy that was far more aggressive than what we had in the past, but nowhere near as aggressive as what we've adopted under COREC, by essentially requiring that those students be on that pathway to gateway course completion within the first year, but leaving the institutions to kind of their own devices in terms of making sure that those pathways were in place and that they were actually enforcing enrollment on those pathways. And so we learned a number of other lessons, and this all sets as kind of the immediate precursor for the creation of the COREC task force. So what did we learn? Well, basically the institutions kind of fell into three groups, for lack of a better term. We had institutions that I always refer to as Kool-Aid drinkers. So they understood the research and they had at least one faculty member who was really championing COREC. And that was absolutely important. And we see from those institutions that took that approach with the gateway policy, their data was significantly more positive than some of the other institutions that either just played lip service to the policy or were kind of complacent participants. So those were some real challenges that we had to overcome in those first 7 years. But also realizing that we did lose some control in terms of the desire of the institutions to micromanage the data that was then presented to the board. And the purpose of that data was to show individual institutions' progress towards full-scale implementation. So we basically sent data benchmarks in terms of the percent of students that had to be on that pathway. And what we found was over time, we ended up spending an inordinate amount of our time discussing with institutions what went into the N for the purpose of calculating the numerator, what went into the numerator in terms of calculating that percent of students that were on the pathway. And so in some cases, that actually became counterproductive. Another thing we very quickly realized was there was a considerable fear of any type of enrollment enforcement, to the extent that we had institutions claiming if we force students onto this pathway, they'll just drop out. And the reality of it is there was never any data that came forward that actually supported that fear, because it was just that. It was kind of an unfounded fear. Another issue that we faced was we had some institutions where it basically was sort of a revolving door when it came to their team members. So every time we met with the team, they had different people at the table. Anytime, and I think this is kind of a given for most people, but anytime you're doing this kind of work, it really is important that there's continuity in terms of the individuals that are responsible for implementation. Because with each turnover, whenever there's that kind of change, what we found was information was not being shared with folks when they came into the new role. And it really ended up in some institutions, and in some cases, it was the larger institutions that really suffered because of that. But this next one, do not make decisions based on sunk costs. When we realized that the Gateway Course Initiative was starting to drag, while it was an aggressive step forward, and we had so much invested in terms of the data framework that we had created to measure progress, we realized that we couldn't, basically make a decision based on sunk costs, because if we did, we would have resisted then pushing the mandate towards COREC. And of course, you've already heard about the aligning of the stars. So we realized while there was progress that was made with Gateway, we really could go a lot further with the COREC mandate. And that was, again, ultimately adopted in 2019. And that policy, next slide, please, basically provides just-in-time support. But the key to this, the real key to all of this, and you saw it in Theo's slides, is that focus on closing the achievement gap. Because whether we wanted to admit it or not, we were doing a significant disservice to our minority students. And you see that across the data, especially those students who would end up considerably behind the starting line in being deeply embedded in remediation for several semesters before they got to the Gateway course. So it ultimately meant a mandate that eliminated those traditional remedial pathways and required that every student, upon enrollment, be enrolled in either a COREC or the college level gateway course. That policy was ultimately approved in June of 19. And there was some exceptions in there. We have exceptions in there for high school students and students with disabilities. So they're basically, while we eliminate traditional pathways for those students that are considered high school students, we really made a verbiage change and said those are really college preparatory courses for those students who are still enrolled in high school. So then with the adoption of the policy, the discussion that we had with the board was taking for the first time in the system a real system-wide approach to implementation, which really led to the creation of the task force, which James is now going to talk about. And they are literally in the middle of that work now because all of this work must be in place at full scale by fall of 21. So finally, my last slide here concerns what were the lessons that we learned kind of from the 300,000 foot view. Early on in the work, and James will talk a little bit about this, we really needed to realize very quickly the need for adequate system level resources. We had no budget for this when the policy was first adopted, and we did not have any knowledge of grants that were out there. So when we first began the work with the task force, we needed an individual that would help guide this work. So we took the step of hiring a consultant. And I really did a disservice to the consultants and to the institutions. Because I had no funding, I had to cut my own travel budget. And we were basically paying that consultant $1,000 a meeting to lead the work. Well, the reality of it is that what we should have been doing from the very beginning was digging deep into the details as quickly as possible. But what we found, what we were really doing at some of these meetings early on, was we were still selling the sale. So we were still bringing in consultants who were talking about the efficacy of COREC when we had adopted the mandate. And so I actually had faculty members and administrators who came and expressed frustration saying, we want to actually get into the details of this work. You don't have to sell us the sale anymore. One key decision that merits a little bit of discussion here is the approach that we took in terms of the action plan development. What we told our board was, when they adopted the policy, we requested 2 years to develop a system-wide action plan that would be presented to the board that would guide the work across the system so that there would be some consistency in terms of implementation. And it would allow the institutions to work together and leverage resources across the system for an effective implementation. But early on, we asked the task force, what type of approach do they want to take to that? So we gave them a couple of options. Initially, what we said was, you can have an institution level or a sector level approach. Now, with an institution level approach, that would have allowed the institutions basically across our system to present 7 action plans. So it really was saying that you are going to have complete control at your institution, and the expectation would be that there would be considerable variation between the institutions. The alternative that we gave them was a sector level approach. So the community colleges would work together to have a consistent plan, and then the 4-year institutions would work together. Much to our surprise and absolute delight, the task force chose early on to take a discipline level approach. So that basically locked us in at that point to ensuring that we had common pathways, common placement across the system, which really is a much more uniform approach to this work across the system. Now, I will tell you that it has had its challenges as well, because while we were very vocal in saying that with this discipline level approach, the institutions are committing to consistency in ways that they have not been consistent in the past, what we found was that individual institutions and faculty members that were representatives on the task force, they always had a tendency to default to their accustomed approach, which is, this is the way my institution is going to do it. And so that has not necessarily created friction, but it's something that we've always had to continue to remind them of, which is, you committed to a system-wide approach with the discipline level approach, and therefore we're not going to have 7 different approaches, especially to key issues like pathways. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to James, and he's going to talk to you about the creation of the task force and the work that they're in the middle of today.
Thank you very much, Crystal and Theo. So we've talked obviously up to this point about the impetus for understanding the problem and challenges with our traditional remediation work for decades and how that led obviously to the development of a statewide scaled policy and how we have set the stage then, as Crystal alluded to, with a statewide approach to implementation. And so in the next several minutes, I want to kind of describe the implementation approach, some of the successes and obstacles that we've had to overcome, and continue to stay the course amidst the current environment that all of us in higher education and education in general are facing, along with every sector in this world with the pandemic and the economic declines. So as Vice Chancellor Abba mentioned, we established a statewide co-requisite implementation task force. And it was really important that the statewide implementation task force had representation from all 7 of our teaching institutions. And it was very prescribed representation, meaning that each of the 7 teaching institutions needed to identify an English lead, a math lead, an advising lead, and an administrator lead. And sometimes the administrator lead would come from the provost's office. Sometimes the administrative lead would come from the office of the registrar, whatever the institution felt was necessary. But the point I'm trying to make is this very large task force, to get the work done in the 2-year timeframe that we had, needed to sort of organize itself into some subcommittees to really get into the nitty-gritty. And based on what Crystal was describing as the discipline level approach, it only made sense that we create subcommittees based on that level within this system task force. And so 4 subcommittees were established, 1 for English, 1 for math, 1 for administration, and 1 for advising. A little bit about our timeline for implementation now, as this task force, this implementation task force has gone through its work. As was mentioned, the task force was established in fall of 2019. This was just a couple of months after the statewide policy was firmly established and codified. And from there, the meetings began. And as Crystal mentioned, in the first several months, we really kind of grappled with how much to continue to inform the task force members and the constituents that they represent about what COREC is and how much we need to get into the nitty-gritty associated with this work. And so over the fall 2019 semester and into the spring 2020 semester, meetings continued where we were talking about the development of new models of math and English pathways, and certainly through that work, reforming the traditional models of curriculum in that way. We talked about the scaling of existing co-requisite support courses, and new pilots were established in fall and in spring of this last academic year. And over that period of those 2 semesters, statewide task force convenings took place all the way up until March. And then in March, the world came to a screaming halt, as we all know, and the pandemic hit us with full fanfare, and the reactions to that at our higher education institutions, just like yours, became very, very real. And so although we continued to need to stay the course and want to stay the course, the idea of flying folks into these statewide task force meetings to gather around the same table and break bread together as they work through these very nuanced design work was just not a reality. And so in some ways, it was a blessing in disguise because we were able to really utilize technology like we're doing today to meet all of our task force members wherever they were at odd times of day and night to get this work continuing to happen. In the summer of 2020, the sort of outcome of the work from fall and spring began to manifest itself into some formal documentation. And it was during the summer 2020 term where our action plan for implementation was beginning to take formalization. There were several different categories in our implementation action plan that centered around pathways and common placement protocols and communication and the marketing of this new effort, strategies around advising and enrollment enforcement and how we were going to assess our work, and certainly if there were any resource needs, what those resource needs were to meet full scale. And so each of those components of the action plan began to be formalized by the COREC task force team, and we were able to get a lot of work done in that summer. In fact, we were able to prepare part 1 of a 2-part action plan that we were going to present to the board in September of 2020, and we did just that. So as the fall semester rounded a corner and faculty began returning back to the virtual campus, so to speak, we really presented that action plan to the board. It was met with 100% approval. We made a slight modification to the policy, the board did, and we hit the ground running to continue to iron out the rest of the nuances associated with our action plan. And that's sort of where we stand today. Continuing as we look ahead in the rest of this fall semester and into the spring 2021 experience, we're really focusing heavy right now on training and professional development for our faculty in English and math, and certainly our advising staff. Recognizing that without solid statewide professional development offered to these groups of faculty and staff, and supported by the institutions with their own level of institutional professional development, there was no way this work was going to be done. And so we really have been spending a lot of time aligning with content experts from a variety of states, many of whom are represented probably today on this presentation, who have helped lead the way for us in this training and professional development experience. And ultimately, this is all leading to fall 21, where we will aim for full-scale implementation. So early on, we talked about there being some very significant wins in terms of commonality associated with how each of our 7 institutions were going to engage in this work. And these are just some bubbles of some of those common elements to our implementation plan. It was important for us from an articulation and transfer standpoint across the entire state that the math pathways were the math pathways. If you were majoring in liberal arts, then no matter which of the 7 teaching institutions you were going to attend in Nevada, you were going to take quantitative reasoning. That's Math 120 for us in the state of Nevada. And as our students swirl among different institutions and transfer with Fidelity, we would rest assured that their Gateway Math course would be uniquely, not unique, but would be the same across the institution. So that was a good win. We still have a little bit more work to do in 1 or 2 of those pathways, and we continue those dialogues today. It's also important for us to recognize that while we were engaged in this work, we needed to understand what would put a student into the traditional Gateway course for math and English, and what would put the student into a Gateway course with support, the co-requisite model. And so our task force has really been spending quite a bit of time talking about common placement methodologies. We're really excited that our institutions are engaged in a variety of pilots around new ways of thinking about placement that sort of break down the barriers of that traditional achievement gap creating placement mechanisms. And so we've got institutions across the state who are currently exploring and implementing placement protocols that surround multiple measures and guided self-placement. Some institutions are even helping students to self-remediate in just key areas through summer bridge programs, for example, and so that when they are hitting the ground running in their very first term formally, they are hopefully prepared for actually that Gateway course through products like Alex PPL and EdReady. So these are the kind of placement practices that complement this work that really, by engaging in this sort of collective impact approach with our 7 of our institutions, is coming to light. It was also decided early on that we wanted to have common communication and marketing. For those of you who have been around Complete College America for a long time, and I were to use the word, as Crystal did, 15 to finish, we recognize that that's a branding campaign, right? It's a branding campaign around credit momentum. And the idea, of course, is to make sure the message is consistent, the message is easily recognized and easily understood. Well, same for co-requisite math and English reform. We wanted to make sure that as a state, we were all talking about the language of every student is college ready. And they are college ready because we are going to place them into Gateway Math. And some students may require a little extra seat time with support that's happening simultaneous, but every student is college ready. And so we've designed a communication toolkit similar to the 15 to finish toolkit, thanks to our friends in Hawaii. But in Nevada, we've partnered with one of our colleges, Great Basin College, and their communication and marketing team is just on fire. To date, they've produced about 90 pieces of collateral with shared messaging, templates that the institutions can download, brand as their own, and run with. Everything from posters to flyers to social media content to PowerPoint template presentations to students to high school counselor letters and the like. So we're really, really pleased with the common approach to communication and marketing. It's also important for the task force to engage in common principles associated with advising and also associated with enrollment enforcement. So it's one thing to say, hey, you know, advisors, can you do a really good job for us and make sure students understand what this co-requisite experience is going to be about. It's another thing to bring the advisors together across the entire state, have them work on a co-requisite advising handbook that would kind of tell the who, what, when, and why of this work, and really help to shape out advisors' understandings of the placement protocols and pathways. And so they've engaged in the development of an advising handbook, and they are currently involved an advising series right now, professional development series that'll take them through a myriad of different workshops over the next year or so. And then, of course, no policy is a good policy unless you can ensure that it's actually being enforced. And so it's really important to know that each of our institutions, although we are saying students, you must complete Gateway Math and English with or without support within your first 2 semesters after matriculation, it's another thing to actually require them to do that with hard holds and assurances that that's happening. And so enrollment enforcement protocols are being developed at each of the institutions based on their own student information system processes and their own capacities with their human resources. And we have plans now in place for all 7 institutions to ensure that enrollment enforcement is happening. A little bit about the industry co-requisite implementation action plan. As I alluded to earlier, this is categorically placed by English, by math, and in those 2 contexts, placement, pathways, and assessment of student learning protocols are established, faculty training and professional development, advising, communication, and so we're really excited about our implementation action plan. Just a quick preview. For English, in the context of placement, the task force, the English representatives on the task force all came to reinforce what was already prescribed in board policy around standardized test scores. So for those institutions who were still going to utilize ACT or SAT or an AccuPlacer or a RightPlacer kind of experience as part of their placement protocols, we wanted to make sure that the test scores for entry into the traditional gateway course as compared to the open enrollment within COREC were going to be uniform. Also, institutions decided to engage in student portfolio work to evaluate for placement, a variety of multiple measure variables, and in some institutions right now, they're exploring guided self-placement with those multiple measure variables so that there's more human contact in that decision-making process between advisors and students. Related to pathways, as we've talked about this entire time, every student is college ready and they're going to place themselves either through a guided self-placement or through more traditional placement protocols into the gateway course. And it will be helpful for them to know if they are a good candidate for additional seat time or additional support, just-in-time support experiences. And so as you look at pathway 1, 2, and 3 there, all 3 of those are essentially Composition 101. They get credit for the completion of Comp 101, and they'll get the just-in-time support that they need if they need it. And from an assessment standpoint, the overwhelming theme here, and this is the case for math as well, is continuous improvement focus. And so our English faculty across the state have agreed to common student learning outcomes as prescribed by the common outcomes of the traditional English gateway course. And then they've also developed some assessment plans based on common principles for assessing English. And they've agreed to meet annually as a state task force to discuss the outcomes of those assessment results. And hopefully that leads to continuous improvement exercises for many, many years. Along the lines of math, similar to English, common placement, common pathways, and common assessment protocols. I alluded to earlier that many of our institutions in the placement space are leveraging ALEKS PPL and Ready platforms to help students self-remediate in just the areas that they need in preparation for their first experience on campus. And those pilots are fully underway. And in many cases, those pilots are years long and are going very, very well. They're no longer pilots. And most of our institutions at this point are also engaged in either practicing or about ready to launch multiple measures approaches to their placement protocols. So we're really excited about that. As far as pathways are concerned for math, there are 2 major pathways that have currently been established and approved that are common across the entire state. The first being the liberal arts pathway with and without support. The second is the STEM pathway. Those are for students who are calculus bound. They're taking the college algebra course in preparation for calculus. And then right now, the state task force is working through what the pathway ought to be for business and for health science students. Maybe this time next year, we'll be able to report back on where we've landed on that work. And then just like English from an assessment standpoint, flexible outcomes are obviously needed for the co-requisite courses because of the just-in-time student support need. But all of the outcomes are centered around the gateway course outcomes, regardless of if it's with or without additional support. And just like English, they've agreed on common assessment themes for the gateway portion of the courses, and they've agreed to meet annually to discuss their assessment findings from a student learning outcome assessment approach. All very, very good in the lens of continuous improvement. I want to talk a little bit more about math faculty training and professional development and how we were able to leverage a state system to the implementation effort. One of the early tasks we did in our implementation focus is we took an audit on where our institutions were with qualified math and English faculty. remember, we're going from, in many cases, or at least in some cases, long rows of traditional remediation courses. These are below college level courses. And so in historic past, we would have, say, adjunct faculty members who might not have had a master's degree in mathematics. They may have had a master's degree in, say, curriculum instruction, for example, or some other master's area, or a bachelor's degree in secondary math education. Many of our adjuncts are coming from the K-12 space and serving as part-time instructors for our institutions. But to deliver that college level math gateway course with or without co-requisite support, it was important for us from an accreditation standpoint, a quality standpoint, to make sure that all of our faculty, adjunct and full-time, have the appropriate credentials to deliver these gateway courses. And so after that audit, we discerned that we didn't have much of a gap in our English discipline for adjunct faculty credentials, but for our math discipline, we did. And so we partnered with University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who has a math graduate program already. And we asked them to contemplate creating an 18 graduate credit hour graduate certificate in post-secondary mathematics education. And they've done just that. And so currently right now, we're pleased that this online program is being taken by adjunct faculty from around the state. And over the course of a year, they will have completed these 18 graduate credit hours in this online program, and they will be ready to participate in the full-scale implementation of this work in fall 21. It was also important beyond the certificate program to train adjunct faculty and full-time faculty to actually deliver these support courses alongside our full-time faculty. That was the only way we're going to reach full scale. And so, as I mentioned earlier, lots of professional development and training around course pedagogy, around flipping the classroom, around the curricular design and how that needs to be different, both for in-class traditional instruction, face-to-face instruction, and certainly the online modality. As we all know too well, it's happening in droves right now. And I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our external partners who have helped to support some of this effort around training and professional development. If it weren't for money dedicated from our Board of Regents through a Nevada Energy budget and through grants from Strong Start to CMC Foundation, we would be nowhere ready for implementation in fall 21. So many thanks to ECMC and Strong Start to Finish and NV Energy. I mentioned earlier that we took a statewide approach to the academic advising protocols. They have developed a co-requisite advising guidebook. They are right now involved in a statewide advising summit, and it's really become a workshop series in this global pandemic era, where each month the advisors across the state will gather between now and April to really hone in on equitable practices surrounding advising, really understanding the nitty-gritty around co-requisite and college-ready students because of the college-ready co-requisite platforms. And we're really emphasizing the importance of institutional communication with advisors. It's not a one and done experience. This should be ongoing, it should be built in to all of our strategic plan efforts. And really emphasizing also that most of this work to get the message to students is going to be reliant on our advisors communicating properly with our students. And we're lucky to have just tremendous advisors who are all in on this effort across our state. And they're really excited to play such a key role in this implementation and beyond. From a communication and marketing standpoint, consistent messaging and branding is important through that development and implementation of our co-requisite communication toolkit. This is serving as communication platform with students, with high school personnel, like high school counselors, for example, as you're preparing students for entry into our institutions, communication with internal campus communities. And again, I mentioned this was developed by our Great Basin College marketing and communication team and supported by a Strong Start to Finish grant. And so if any of you are interested in taking a look at that communication toolkit for perhaps helping create ways that you can communicate in your states and systems or institutions, we'd be happy to share some of that messaging. Just a quick snapshot of what some of this has looked like. As I mentioned, there's well over 90 pieces of collateral. They've decided on consistent branding through color schemes and fonts, consistent logos. Certainly here's some snapshots of some flyers and posters. There's PowerPoint templates and press release templates and newsletter content and social media messaging that institutions can plug and play, brand as their own, but also retain the branding of the consistency for our state implementation work. So we're really thankful to Great Basin College and all of their work associated with the consistent branding of this co-requisite experience. As we talk about and wrap up here today, what has kept the momentum going? There's been so many reasons why it would be just easier to say, you know what, there is so much going on right now related to the global pandemic, the social unrest and injustice that's happening in this world, so many distractions in there that really take priority maybe in some of this work. the economic decline that's happening across our country related to outcomes of the pandemic. You know, this big project around co-requisite implementation is a huge, massive thing. And we were cooking right before that pandemic hit it. And it would have been easy for us to say, let's just stop. Let's delay. Let's ask our Board of Regents for another year or two to fully implement this work. And then the more and more we thought about that, and this thought was basically about 5 seconds, it was no. If we truly value what led us to create this policy and what led us to go down this implementation track around equity and around closing the achievement gap, we have to stay the course. Because if we don't, now more than ever, those achievement gaps are only going to widen, and we're going to be worse off for our students than ever before. And so we took the very active approach of staying the course, and we added through collaboration, recognizing that no institution, no individual at the system office, no third-party partner, no one funder could really help this work to full scale on their own. We needed to create this network. And so we're thankful to all 7 of our teaching institutions. We're thankful for our Nevada System of Higher Education and our Board of Regents for dedicating support to this work. We're thankful for the Complete College America Network and the leadership at CCA. We're thankful for Strong Start to Finish and the ECMC Foundation and Nevada Energy, as we all kind of gather around this idea of let's stay the course, let's keep in this momentum going through this collaboration, and we will see the finish line for at least first initial scaled implementation. And we'll continue the efforts around continuous improvement for years to come. So I will end today with a few implementation challenges and lessons learned. As Crystal mentioned near the beginning, it is really important that we hit the ground running from the beginning. After the state, the system, the institution, whatever context you might be in right now, has decided that we are going to adopt a co-requisite model, we can't sell the sale. And we found ourselves in the implementation phase also kind of trickling back to why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? But we continue to just focus the efforts on the implementation and pivoted it with flexibility as necessary. We also recognize in our implementation efforts that we needed to continue with dedicated resources for implementation support. It would be very easy in the economic decline to say, you know what, we're going to cut this or we're going to cut that. But as it relates to this student success work and closing the achievement gap, this is one of those things where you have to have dedicated resources and can keep consistency with that. We also have to recognize that we are not in control of some of the things that are hitting our space, right? With the COVID-19 pandemic, with the economic challenges, with the social injustice, and all of that leading to faculty and staff burnout and health concerns and the like. We have to be able to pivot, but not off course. We might have to take a quick detour and get back on course immediately after that detour, but we have to stay focused during the implementation. One foot forward in front of the other. We also needed to recognize that the math pathway alignment across the entire state was our biggest hurdle and continues to be our biggest hurdle. And rather than put our head in the sand and say, you know what, we're just going to rest on our institutional approaches, we didn't. We needed to really pay full focus on working through a consensus methodology to reach what is in the best interest of our students across the state. And so our focus on math pathway alignment continues today, and we should have some pretty good finalization of that here in the next several months. And then finally, flexibility, 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 but focus on the end finish line and stay the course. So with that, we want to thank you so very much for joining us for this session as part of our Complete College America virtual experience this week. And we leave you with our email addresses on the screen here. If any of you would like to reach out, by all means, we would love to hear from you. We have been proud members of the CCA Alliance family for a decade or more, and I know that many of you have as well. And we look forward to our continued collaborations as we all work together to increase student success and decrease and ultimately eliminate these achievement gaps once and for all. Thank you very much.